This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello and welcome to the Late Late Show. My name is Catherine Taylor. Tonight, my special guest is Professor Rachel Lofthouse. I'll be chatting to Rachel about all things teacher professional learning as we discuss her research into supporting teachers into becoming research engaged, reactive and reflective professionals.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Late Late Show, everyone. I'm Catherine Taylor, speaking here from Buckinghamshire in the UK. On tonight's show, I'll be talking to Professor Rachel Lofthouse. Rachel is a Professor of Teacher Education in the Carnegie School of Education at Leeds Beckett University, and she has a specific research interest in professional learning, exploring how teachers learn and how they can be supported to put that learning into action in their practice. Tonight we'll be discussing Rachel's research into the conditions that support teachers to become reflective, research-engaged practitioners and the factors that best support teachers' capacity for professional learning. Remember, if you're listening in live and you'd like to join us either live in the studio to ask questions or to chat or to post questions in the chat for Rachel to answer, or if you want to call in and speak to us, then please download the Podbean app or visit ttradio.org and click on Listen Live on the homepage. This should take you directly to the show, and there you can post comments and questions during our conversation. Once I've spoken to Rachel, I'll open up for anyone who wants to call in. You can then call by pressing the icon at the top of the screen on your phone's app. Click this and I'll be able to connect you. And I'm delighted to welcome Professor Rachel Lofthouse onto Teachers Talk Radio. Welcome, Rachel.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. And how's your day been? How are you?
It's been fine, thank you. Pretty wet here in Yorkshire, but apart from that, all good.
Excellent. Right, so let's have a quick chat then. Could you set the scene for our listeners and just let us know what a typical day or week is like for you as far as your current role is concerned?
That is a very typical and good question. But actually, there's nothing typical. And that's one of the things that is both enjoyable and also quite occasionally frustrating about the role. But the job that I do includes, and I've done a bit of this today, a bit of it last week, a bit of it the week before, developing and leading teaching programs, thinking about those as individual sessions, but also as coherent courses, thinking about doctoral students, thinking about how to support my doctoral students and my master's students. So today, for example, I've been allocated a number of dissertation students who will all complete their dissertation this year for their masters. So I'm finding out a bit about them today, and also conducting my own research. So thinking ahead, what research am I doing now? Where am I taking that? What do I want it to lead to? What are the questions that are emerging as the evidence comes in? That's quite a typical process. And then thinking about partnership work and community building through collective ed and a variety of other projects.
That sounds really interesting and diverse, and it kind of strikes a chord with me because I think, well, I don't know if other people listening probably don't know that I'm sort of on my, hopefully the final stages of my ED at the moment. And I just can't imagine ever doing another research project ever again after this one, not because I don't like it, but because I can't imagine getting to this point again. But to have that as your job, I think, that's pretty exciting. In terms of the way that you kind of interact with new and emerging teachers in your work, it would be really interesting to hear from you about, what attracts you to the sort of emerging professional sort of field, if you like, the initial teacher education and so on?
Well, I guess like a lot of us working in education, the things that pull us towards a future are the experiences that we're having now and our reflections on the experiences that we've had in the past and how we connect those through to what we hope for in the future. So, in terms of my research in professional learning, I've always been very proud of my career as a teacher, and I still see myself as a teacher. But as a teacher, it is going back to the 1990s. I was in a privileged position to be able to work alongside other teachers through networks to develop practice through the university that we lived close to. So we were part of research networks, we were part of funded research projects, but also we were very fortunate that the local authorities that we worked with had this holistic understanding of how they could support the development of practice in classrooms, the curriculum making that teachers were able to do by supporting teacher learning. So I feel as if my own experience made a huge difference to my interest. And then when I became a teacher educator, clearly I had that chalk-faced responsibility for supporting teachers with a range of different expectations for themselves in their future roles and different backgrounds to become the sorts of teachers that they could be proud of and to flourish and to do really good work. So having the opportunity to continue to unpack and understand that through research has always been the privilege really of my role.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And I wonder, actually, just taking you back to that time when you were in schools, were you involved in mentoring a lot of student trainee teachers at that time? And I've just been reading a paper you sent me over, and I've just realised I've said student trainee teachers, which is really mixing it up there, because I know you like to separate those things out. We can maybe talk about that in a little bit. But were you involved as a practitioner at the time in bringing teachers through in their early career phases?
Yes. So I taught for 10 years in secondary schools, and in the second job that I had for 5 years, I was a head of department, but also always a mentor for student teachers who came through the Newcastle University partnership. And that direct mentoring experience was what, if you like, formed the foundation for my work as a teacher educator. But again, it was both the one-to-one experience with the student teachers that we hosted, but also the opportunity to work as a visiting lecturer occasionally. So to go out and observe other students teaching in their contexts and to work with their mentors and to think about that moderation process, but also to occasionally go into the university to support talk sessions so that we were able, as a cohort of mentors, to draw really explicitly on the particular skills and interests that we had and bring that into being in our teacher education programs.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you. And, thinking about all of these things, so one of the things I found really interesting as I was reading the papers that you shared with me was about the learning journey of the mentor as well as of the student teacher. I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about kind of the professional growth from the mentor's perspective.
Well, I guess the first thing to acknowledge is that just as every student teacher is unique, every mentor they work with is unique. So that means that every mentoring relationship and partnership is a unique working relationship. And I guess as educators, it is relatively natural to extend our role into mentoring, but it doesn't mean it comes easily. Because as educators in schools, as school teachers, we're clearly dealing with children and young people. We've got, in a secondary school, a very particular subject specialism, hopefully, and we're working towards a very particular curriculum. In a primary school, we've got that greater breadth that we're working with. But we're thinking about ourselves as the adult working with the child or the young person. when we're thinking about mentoring, clearly that shifts. It shifts into a working developmental relationship between two adults, and there is always that switch you have to flick, I think, to remember that yes, of course, you're there to support their learning and their development, but you're also there as a colleague in that moment, but also in that they will become a future colleague for others like you in the profession. So there's quite a lot of opportunity to broaden out your understanding of education as if you like, in the context of schools, but also education beyond, working alongside children and young people to working alongside adults. I think it's a very interesting role. I think it's one that there are lots of pitfalls. Without doubt, there are lots of pitfalls, but there's also lots of opportunity for formative development along the way.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. And, I work with a lot of trainees and also ECTs and their mentors, and, seeing themselves as people who are in receipt of CPD is sometimes a challenge for workload reasons, for other kinds of reasons. And it's a quite a difficult tightrope to walk, I think, as the person causing it.
I think it really is. And I think if we're absolutely honest, it's got much tougher, and it probably is about to get tougher still, because of the extra demands of the new accredited programs, the new DFE accredited programs for ITT.
You mean the ECF as well?
And the ECF, yes, certainly the capacity for mentoring in many schools has needed to be doubled, if not more than doubled, because of early career teachers also being required to be formally mentored. And the expectation for the training of mentors is increasing. But also, I think we are in a different world. We're working now in a world which is more prescribed by the DFE, and that to some extent gives us a scaffold and a structure, but to other extent does make it sometimes significantly harder to really shape the experiences that we offer to our student teachers through mentoring to suit them, their needs and their context.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I've recently taken on this role, and I'm sort of really finding out about it. I certainly won't consider myself an expert, but I'm finding out all kinds of things around that. Listen, Rachel, we've had a brilliant talk so far. I do have to play our messages in the news, so I'm just going to mute us both for about 7 or 8 minutes, if that's okay, and then we'll come back and have a bit more of a chat.
Of course.
Perfect, thank you.
Are you looking for lesson planning materials to kickstart the new term? We've got you covered. The Day is a global online resource that turns the news into lessons. We're offering listeners a free resource on Andrew Tate that you can find on thedaynews.co/Tate. Inspire personal development and critical thinking for your students by downloading the Tate Debate today, and feel more confident addressing sensitive topics with your class. Visit thedaynews.co/Tate to find out more.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
A record number of students from disadvantaged backgrounds have applied for the most selective UK university degrees, says a report on the BBC News website. The report is based on data released by the Universities and Colleges Admissions Service, known as UCAS. The students have applied to Oxford and Cambridge and for degrees in medicine, dentistry and veterinary science. UCAS Interim Chief Executive Sander Crystal described the applications, which have an October deadline, as encouraging. The Sutton Trust charity, however, said that the advantage gap had hardly shifted. The data is based on a participation of local areas measure, which splits students into 5 groups based on how many people aged 18 and 19 in their area go on to higher education. Those from areas where the fewest numbers of young people go to university are classed as the most disadvantaged. Applications for this group are up by 7% since last year, in contrast to the most advantaged areas, which is up by only 2%. However, the total number of applicants from the most advantaged areas is over 17,000, compared to a little over 3,000 from the most disadvantaged areas. Other key findings from October applications include a 6% increase in the number of UK applicants receiving free school meals, although the overall numbers of those receiving free meals is on the rise. A drop of 7% a year in 18-year-olds applying to medicine degrees, and a slight drop in total numbers of international applicants. Education Secretary Gillian Keegan was in the news again this week as she told English schools that parents have a right to view the sex education materials which are being taught in schools. The announcement comes as the government is due to launch a public consultation into relationships, sex and health education. Guidance has been in place since the subject became compulsory in primary and secondary schools in September 2020. But Ms Keegan said she wanted to debunk the myth that parents cannot see what their children are being taught. Jeff Barton of Askell said he agreed with transparency on RSHE materials and that this is key, but that sending the letter when some schools were on half-term was slightly odd. The BBC also reports that Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, has been accused of misleading the public about the risks of social media and of contributing to a mental health crisis amongst youth. The claims were made in a federal lawsuit in the United States, but many in other countries will be following with interest. The lawsuit accuses the company of ensnaring users whilst concealing the substantial dangers of its platforms. It also said that the company had collected data on children under the age of 13 and that this breached the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. Meta is contesting the lawsuit and will likely present research it says shows that teens say social media actually helps them when they are struggling. It's not the first time social media companies have faced lawsuits, but it is the first time so many attorneys general, 33 in total, have signed such a suit, in addition to those already filed by families, young people and school districts. Those working with children and young people in the UK will undoubtedly be interested in the progress of the lawsuit. Dyslexia Scotland has announced on its website that former Strictly Come Dancing winner and Dyslexia Scotland ambassador Hamza Yassin will talk to an audience as part of Dyslexia Awareness Week Scotland. Yassin, who is dyslexic, became an ambassador for the charity earlier this year. He says he is passionate about sharing his story during events held in the first week in November. In a week where The Guardian reports that more than 1 million UK children experienced destitution last year, meaning their families could not adequately feed, clothe, clean or keep them warm, the BBC covered a story of a primary school in Peckham where most children are homeless. The school has nearly 300 pupils, all of whom receive free uniform, trips and meals. The school conducted a survey in which most families describe themselves as living in non-secure tenancies. This can mean sofa surfing with friends, living in B&B accommodation or living in hostels. Parents of children at the school spoke positively about the support they received from the school, but also focused on the toll the uncertainty took on them and their children. Meanwhile, The Guardian tells of concerns expressed by poverty campaigners, teachers and welfare workers about the damaging effects of destitution, including physical ill health, mental illness, school absence and poor behaviour. Both articles can be found online and give more details on the latest findings. Finally, Schools Week reports that as many as 1 in 10 school workers had to wait over 60 days for DBS checks last year. A Freedom of Information request showed that 2.5% of those submitted took more than 60 days to complete, more than triple the rate in 2021 to 22. Jeff Barton of Askell says it all adds to the pressure that school leaders and teachers face in recruitment and reflects the widespread underinvestment in public services. A spokesperson for the DBS said neither Ofsted nor the D of E have raised any concerns about delays. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Welcome back everybody, and welcome back to Professor Rachel Lofthouse. Thank you for holding on there during the news and the messages. I'd just like to bring our chat back round again, if I may, to your experiences of leading teacher development. And I know that you have been involved in designing and developing a model that supports teacher career, indeed lifelong professional learning. And I wondered if you could just walk us through the principles of that model, if you don't mind.
Yes, I can do. It's typically, as a model, it's easier to understand visually, probably.
That's great for a podcast.
I know, than by describing it in a paragraph. But I'll do what I can. The model comes from my own PhD research, which itself was based on publication. So a range of different papers, chapters, and research reports, which I then synthesized to understand from them what could be understood about teachers' learning and the relationship to the development of their practice. And the very heart of the model is a sense of activity, that learning is an active process, but it also immediately throws up a warning, which is that it is easier to keep people busy and for people to look and feel busy than it might be to really enable substantial professional learning with a link to the development of practice. So it suggests, if you like, that we need to pay attention to the nature of that busy work. So at the heart of it is a sense that there's lots of different types of activity that can support teachers to learn and develop their practice, including things like being mentored if you're a student teacher, being part of coaching practice if you're a teacher or a leader and your focus is on leadership development, or being part of a teacher learning network where there's a shared focus and maybe some development of materials and ideas, and people go away and practice and they come back and discuss and reflect on the impact of that work in their own classrooms, maybe action research, maybe even attending CPD and keeping some kind of reflective journal or discussing with colleagues later some of the learning from that CPD. So of course there's this busy work. And so designing work that really works, if you see what I mean, matters more than making sure you just keep people busy, because we're busy enough. But then there's also a sense of what can we do that really powers up that work. So regardless of whether our attention is on mentoring or coaching, or teachers undertaking research projects, or teachers trialing and practicing techniques that they're learning in CPD sessions, there are certain things that are likely to be attributes that really help that to generate impact. And one of those things is the need for that work to feel authentic, for it to be very deeply rooted in the context. So it's not just bought off the shelf or generic. So that authenticity matters. Also, the need for that work to be based on and also help to generate a sense of solidarity. So that shared concern for children's learning outcomes, children's welfare, whatever the real purpose of that work is, that's shared amongst colleagues, but also is understood and felt to be of value by the students in the setting. And another attribute is the attribute to think creatively, to think beyond the literal, beyond the obvious, and also to be given permission to do that. So that, yes, you might hear of a really fabulous way that somebody down the corridor to you is teaching, but that might be in a different subject area or in a different key stage. And you've got to think creatively about how you adapt that and make it make sense in your own context. So on one side of the model are these attributes, with the idea that if you are mentoring or coaching or thinking about CPD, if you can build on and build in those attributes, it is more likely to have impact. It's more likely to be engaged with, and it's more likely to translate into changes in practice. And then on the other side of the model is a sense of, so what happens? What happens when teachers learn, and what happens as they develop their practice with confidence? And this is more than just picking up a new additional technique and sticking that into your lesson routine. Learning is more than that, I think. So there are three things, and they don't necessarily come in this order. Everything's always in relationship with each other. But one of the things that starts to happen when teachers really learn and develop their practice is that they learn from and are also able to critique information they're given, practice they see, or their direct experience. That's not the same as being constantly subject to criticism being dished or having the role of dishing out feedback, which is criticism. Critique is much more subtle than that. It's about being able to use discernment. So again, you read, get one of your John Catt books from your sponsor, read the book, but don't just sponge it. Don't just assume that everything in it is gold. Apply some critique, and also be prepared to share your practice and let people critique that. Again, not in a way that's just about slamming you down or criticizing, but just saying, well, I wonder whether, and have you tried, and what happens when? And that asking those kind of curious questions really is the critique. So that's one aspect. Learning is opened up by critique, but also opens up the confidence to critique. I think that really matters. That's what keeps us professional. And then there's two other elements.
Sorry, go on.
Well, one of them is the ability to articulate your practice. So to make visible what you're doing for other people, to explain how and why and what in whatever forum, whether that's in a department meeting or in a teach meet or in a blog, or that putting it out there and putting it into words, explaining to others. The more you think about what you're doing, the more you enter into those feedback loops, the more likely you are to be able to articulate that. That's a really important process and part of learning. And then finally, the recognition and desire to continue to expand your repertoire. So as you learn, putting that learning into practice, learning from that putting into practice continues to build and expand both your teaching repertoire, but also your underpinning foundational knowledge. So those are the things you're looking for in this model to be the behaviours that result from learning.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's one of the things as I'm listening to you speak about it, is so much that I recognise from my own research in which is into the relationships between school cultures and teacher professional development and learning, and my experience. There's always this tension, isn't there, between, and I think it's called, judge mentoring, and I think that's like a product of our sort of performative managerial context that we're in England particularly, but in other places as well, where people kind of, I don't know if there's almost a socialized compulsion to to sort of pick up on every little mistake and try and get a result a lot more quickly than you might, if you invested the time and had a bit longer run at people building up their professionalism, you might get a much better result. But we would rather rush and get a quick result, which perhaps burns people out. And one of the experiences that I notice is with my ECTs particularly is they cannot wait to get signed off. They want to get off this ECF train. Can we get an early release from it, please? All the rest of it. And I just keep saying to them, all they'll do is fill up your timetable and stop your mentoring. This should be something that it gives you that chance to reflect. But I think there's such a culture, and I don't know how we get rid of it. I wonder, do you know what I mean?
Absolutely, and I think it's been evident for about 20 years at least in England, but it's really ramped up recently. And I think we're in a bit of a vicious cycle because clearly the more we struggle to recruit and retain teachers, the more pressure there is on the teachers that we have to perform to their, to the very highest ability very quickly. They're being pushed up the career ladder very quickly, and the expectations on them are high. And that means that they become very self-critical, hyper-aware of when they think they're failing as well as when they think they're succeeding. And I think we are at risk of micromanaging a lot of teachers because we're conscious that a lot of teachers are still really in those formative stages of development and therefore to some extent quite vulnerable, but we don't really have the time to offer them as much support and learning opportunities as we might. So we fill that void with micromanagement. And I'm not saying that that's endemic and that's everyone's experience. That would be a really crass thing to say. But I think we see the signs of that just a bit too often. And I think we also have got into a situation where inevitably, because we all feel under pressure, and let's be honest, it's the same in universities, in teacher education particularly, under a lot of the new remits, we feel the need to do things very visibly and very much at a pace, but also very efficiently. And teaching and learning probably isn't well suited to those models. If we're honest, if we really think about it, that kind of efficient, at pace, deliverable, visible stuff, there's a lot more nuance. There's a lot more backwards and forwards in anybody's development, whether you're 3 or 7 or 11 or 18 or 25 or 30. You're not just on a linear track. It's much more complex than that, but we hardly have time to recognize that. And I think that's a real sadness, really.
I mean, when I was starting out on my EdD journey, we had to do a whole project on professionalism, professional paradigms in education. And I very much agree that sort of the managerial, the pursuit of efficiency, I do believe it's actually not compatible with sort of genuine teacher professionalism, because professionalism does seem to entail this nurturing and this growth. And so we are, I think, as you say, we've been in this situation that's been sort of growing. And I think one of the first things I realised when I started reading into this literature is actually quite a sense of first relief and then anger that, no, it wasn't me. And this has actually been known about for years. And then, I think education these days is populated by a generation of teachers who they're like the sort of the frog in the water, or if you like. They don't really understand why it's happened, and they, because we're so kind of diligent and conscientious, we all think it's us. Actually, it's not. We're just in this system that is producing this cognitive dissonance, which we can't resolve because we don't, once you understand it, you go, oh, that's what's happened to me. Oh,
well, I think I mean, it's really interesting that we are, I think, now the youngest teaching profession in Europe, in England. And, you know, youth brings lots of benefits, but also it means that there are fewer people with that that professional memory that of yeah of other times, and that kind of acknowledgement, if you like, that gradually we've become a bit immune to some of the norms in teaching. I was at a conference last week, and I heard a phrase that I should have been aware of, but I wasn't, from one of the keynote speakers. It was Professor Cheryl Craig from a university in the US, and she was drawing on John Dewey's work. So, you know, old work, if you like, old, thoughtful, philosophical work about teaching and learning. But she picked out his concept of dead space. And he talked about and wrote about dead space as spaces that lack imagination, spaces that, if you like, that leave people depleted rather than enriched, and acknowledge that these are not spaces that are conducive to education, but they are spaces that education is at risk of creating. And then what Cheryl did in her keynote was she drew on the stories of teachers internationally, actually, and she gave narratives from these teachers to illustrate what that dead space felt like to them. And it was things like very fixed instrumental curriculum where the teachers had absolutely no agency for modification, adaptation, and attunement of the curriculum. And I think what some of us see and experience is dead space. And that's not a nice space to be in, but we perhaps haven't acknowledged that that's what it is. So that's the term I took away from last week's conference that I need to explore a little bit more, I think.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you. It's not a term I've kind of come across either, but it's a really interesting idea. And I think that, you know, one of the things that I found in my research, and I don't know whether you agree with this, is that number one, the managerial nurse, you know, there is hardly any living memory. It probably is, but that's not quite the right word. But it's not in our kind of professional memory anymore because, you know, most of us have been schooled and trained and worked in that context. But it's also the kind of the bit of the myth that it's the older teachers who are kind of the grumpy ones, the disengaged ones, the problematic ones. And in fact, my research has really challenged that, because wherever I've heard leaders talking about those kinds of teachers, and then I've looked at my data, actually it's not. It's teachers in the middle of their careers. And I guess there's a squeeze, isn't there, between like that sandwich generation with their professional learning and also young families and elderly parents and all of that stuff, probably, you know, their own health and their menopauses and all of that stuff that goes along in middle age. And, you know, I wonder what you think about sustaining professional development when the squeeze can be felt, you know, and this is probably the mentors who are feeling like that rather than the student teachers.
I think it's interesting how we tend to deal in stereotypes, don't we? We can't help it. They're shortcuts to understanding. One of the things, so actually the majority of my work now is not with student teachers, ironically, it's with teachers in service. And also I host networks of quite a lot of teachers in transition. So they're moving between roles, sometimes moving out of teaching into retirement and thinking, what next? But one of the things that I learned a long time ago, actually, was how valuable it was to create spaces for teachers to come together in which they can learn when they're not in single cohorts, by which I mean the sorts of cohorts that we typically now see in, for example, NPQs. Now, I'm not going to badmouth NPQs because clearly they play a part. But if you're doing an NPQ, then you are in a cohort of people who have clearly got a similar professional interest and goal, are likely to be at a similar career stage, have had similar experiences to date, and are working towards quite convergent learning outcomes, because that's what the NPQ offers. What I've realised, first of all, through a variety of research projects and then through creating different communities of teachers as learners, is that some of the most exceptionally vibrant learning spaces are very, very diverse. So having a cohort, for example, on a master's module or a postgraduate certificate module, where amongst the group you have teachers in their second and third year of teaching, teachers who are in their 25th year of teaching, teachers in senior leadership, teachers who haven't yet dipped their toe into leadership, teachers from FE, from secondary, from primary, from early years, from mainstream and special, and sometimes also teachers from an international setting. And this is obviously really enabled particularly by online networking. If you can create that kind of cohort, you stop trading in stereotypes. You allow teachers to be really open to what others bring, whether that's that kind of genuine curiosity and almost naivety of being relatively new, or the more considered, patient, perhaps wisdom of those people who've been around for a while. And you get to a point where you're not just, you know, sometimes you get into a quite cynical space. We all do. I do. But you tend to come out of that quite quickly, because these spaces are also quite unpredictable. So of course there's something we're all sharing together, whether that's a curriculum that underpins a master's module, or, you know, a theme of discussion that we've all come together to discuss. But the stuff that emerges in those discussions is both unique in that time and space and unique to the people, but how the connections are made. For example, the first time I really was aware of this, a master's module on inquiry-based learning with a primary practitioner who was trained in philosophy for children, sharing her understanding of that as a way of developing inquiry in learning, with a consultant palliative care doctor whose job in a teaching hospital was to work with fifth-year doctors in their palliative care module. And he was listening to her talking about how 8-year-olds were dealing philosophically with really big questions about life and death. And he stole that idea and adapted it and reframed his entire palliative care module for fifth-year medical students as a result. And they both gained something from that, as did everybody else in the group. And as the course leader, I couldn't have engineered that. That just emerged. That's really powerful learning.
That is, I mean, that's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I happen to be a philosophy for children practitioner as well, and I can really imagine how powerful that must have been for those children, but also for the doctors involved. It's interesting because one of the things I've been thinking quite a lot about is, how do you put the structure in place that protects the time and facilitates people getting together, you know, having the logistics that supports them to meet and have projects to work on and all of that kind of stuff, without going down a bit of a cul-de-sac of groupthink. Because one of the things I've noticed is that where school leaders abandon the micromanagement and kind of go completely the other way and just have like almost a radical agency because they want to protect teachers from, Ofsted or whatever, then whenever they do try and introduce something new, people are really suspicious of it. They're not used to having to go to extra meetings or a meeting to have a reflection after the training and things like that. So it's putting the structure in, but it's keeping it flexible enough to not go into that groupthink kind of cohort space. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it is truly challenging, I think. And I think particularly for teachers when at the end of a working day, you're absolutely exhausted. And then somebody comes along with their kind of, shall we do this amazing thing together? Let's give ourselves some time to think. I mean, that's often the last thing you want to do. And clearly, you've already identified some of the real challenges around time and resource. I think there's a few things that can help, and one is a sense of consent. So, of course, there's an expectation that teachers invest in themselves in terms of their own professional learning and development. So, and I don't necessarily mean financially, I mean recognizing that that is part of what it is to be a professional.
Yes.
And privileging that and rewarding that as far as it's possible to do. I think that matters. So we say, this is a part of your job, and let's allow you a space to make some choices to what aspects of that you consent to be part of at this point in your career. So I think choice is important. But I also think that there are some things that we can do that help. So, for example, on a lot of courses, the notion of reflection is really fundamental. But it can itself become really quite a chore, particularly if, at the end of every week, you're supposed to write a reflective journal that looks similar to last week's reflective journal, which looks similar to the one 4 months ago. That starts to get quite tedious. So there are certain things that we can do which help to scaffold reflection, for example. And having a suite of tools that you can say, is it helpful this week to do a critical incident analysis, for example, of something that you noticed or something that cropped up that you'd like to pay attention to? Forget everything else. Forget what your target was, if you had a target. What actually emerged that you could analyze using this scaffold of a critical incident analysis? Now, you might do one of those 1 week and then not do another one for another 6 months or a year. But the fact that you've got the tool and the choice might actually be the bit that motivates you to think, yeah, that's helpful for me today. If you've got a tool such as an understanding of, I use the ecological systems tool, for example, where, again, you might be looking at what's going on with a particular child in your class. And of course, you're paying attention to the detail of that child, but you're also starting to think about the ecological layers or systems, if you like, that might be both influencing that child, but also making that child's, what they bring to the classroom have an impact on others. So it's this kind of, it's having a set of tools that we can use critically and creatively that I think can help. And I appreciate that all of that sounds like a burden at 10 to 10 at night. But as a program leader or as a CPD coordinator in a school, acknowledging that we can be scaffolded to think more deeply, whether that's through reflective tools or through practices such as really good quality coaching, and that we gain so much when those scaffolds are in place or when that time is allocated, that actually the benefit starts to be reaped because it allows us to make better decisions in the context in which we're working, which means that we faff around less, we go down fewer blind alleys, and ultimately over time we start to feel that change is possible if change is what is needed. So there isn't an easy answer, but I do think that having more than a series of PowerPoint slides that we can share, or a click-through online training course, those sorts of things are generally not very motivating. And we need to lure people in with things that they will find helpful, but that they can choose from when they want that kind of help. I think that would be my ideal.
Yeah, it's a kind of like the old, I think it's Aristotle, we are what we repeatedly do. And so if we do reflective practice, we become reflective practitioners, perhaps. But yeah, it's easy to say, and structurally, I think, much more challenging. No, thank you so much. We've got about 8 minutes left. I'm just going to play just 2 minutes of messages, and then we'll come back for some closing thoughts. And if anybody listening would like to pop a message in the chat or to phone in, then please do so. I'm just going to mute us for those messages. Hold on a second.
Are you looking for lesson planning materials to kickstart the new term? We've got you covered. The Day is a global online resource that turns the news into lessons. We're offering listeners a free resource on Andrew Tate that you can find on thedaynews.co/Tate. Inspire personal development and critical thinking for your students by downloading the Tate Debate today and feel more confident addressing sensitive topics with your class. Visit thedaynews.co/Tate to find out more.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
I'm just going to pause that there. Thank you so much, Rachel, for holding on the line there. If there is anyone in the studio who'd like to dial in and ask Rachel a question, please do so. Rachel, I want to just, while we wait to see if anyone does phone in, I just want to throw it open to a broader conversation about education. If you had a magic wand, what would your wish be?
Oh. That's a tough question. Goodness me, that is a tough question. I think it's probably an absolutely bizarre response, but you said a magic wand. I think the opportunity to put teachers into a bus and do a bit of time traveling with that bus, but also do a bit of international traveling so that they see the profession as one which is global and also timeless, and feel that sense of, genuine pride, if you like, in the fact that we are a profession that is global and timeless, but also open their eyes to each other and that breadth and the wealth of teaching expertise and repertoire that we have. I think that would be a really lovely thing to be able to do.
No, that would be, and I think to have the time travel bit as well, just to make some time in which to have those conversations, because they do always seem to be squeezed out, aren't they? I mean, it's a real shame that people rush so much. I've been having conversations today with people who are balancing so many different commitments and responsibilities. And, the soft stuff but the
Yeah.
important stuff, that's it falls down the cracks, which is a
Yeah,
real
I
shame.
think an easier thing to achieve, because time travel is quite tricky, is actually to regenerate staff room culture.
Yeah.
And I do appreciate that not everybody has always had positive staff rooms to inhabit, but I do worry a great deal that having squeezed out staff rooms from a lot of teachers' lives, we've lost the opportunity for that informal mentoring, and that support that we get from each other, the humour, I think, that teachers bring to their lives. I think that's missing from a significant number of teachers' lives. So staff room culture, which doesn't have to revolve around cake, although cake's nice, but it's just a natural part of the daily life of teachers, a chance to chill with each other and share and talk, and
Yeah.
that would be great.
No, I agree. I mean, I'm talking of cake. I'm actually in a soup club in our staff room. There's seven of us, and we take turns in making a big vat of soup every week, which is really lovely. But it's probably not everyone's got the time to sort of cater for that. But I think it is so important, and I do kind of see it as part of my responsibility, really, given that I've got to have so much to do with ECTs, and I'm also a union rep as well. So I just kind of feel like it's important to be visible and around for small conversations rather than having to be sought out for big conversations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was talking to a group of coaches last year, and they were funny in a way. They said before we had coaching, we had staff rooms. And it's almost as if they were imagining themselves back out of jobs, because a lot of them were freelance coaches, but they almost wished themselves out of jobs because they kind of wished that we had some of that back in teachers' lives.
No, it's I think it's something that because you kind of can't measure it, and managerialism does like to have a proxy to measure, doesn't it? And because we can't measure it, it's kind of seen as unimportant. But it's I think the amount of burnout that we see, the amount of attrition of people leaving the profession for all kinds of reasons at all kinds of stages, I mean, it clearly is telling us that the soil isn't fertile. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely, yes. It's very unfortunate to have to acknowledge it, but it is also essential to acknowledge it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what the solution would be. I mean, I think people talk about there's obviously uncertainty with the sort of politics at the moment. And, I saw something on Twitter where they were saying, don't let's have a new government come in and do something radical to education, just leave it alone. And I was like, well, no, they could fund it. That would be radical. Because,
Yes.
there's just all of these things sort of cost money. If teachers want sabbaticals, there's a cost to that. If they want flexible working, there's a cost to that. And I think those costs can be offset in the benefits that people bring back, or the sort of the richer conversations that have. If you have a job share, you've got to talk to that person. So I think you do gain in other ways financially and sort of professionally, but there's just so much squeeze. I think there's a real fear of spending that money at the expense of, keeping the lights on or whatever it is, which is a shame.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we need a change, and I absolutely accept that kind of initiative overload would feel too much of a burden for many people at the moment if we had a government that brought in a whole raft of new initiatives in a hurry. But just a bit of easing by funding and a little bit of positive presence as opposed to the more negative, quite toxic presence I think people feel the DFE creates at the moment, those would be welcome changes.
Absolutely. Well, we're very nearly at 10 o'clock. We've come to the end of our chat. Rachel, I'm so happy to have had this conversation with you, and thank you so much. I hope that you've enjoyed sharing your views with us this evening, and I know that so many Teachers Talk Radio listeners will download this podcast and listen back, because that's where most of our sort of traffic comes from, because it's there along with many other topics all week. So please do. Well, it's there for longer than the week. It's there for ages, but it's there. So thank you so much again for joining me this evening, and I really hope to keep in touch with you and carry on these conversations, because I think they're so valuable.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Professor Rachel Lofthouse. And I'll close the show tonight. As I've said, there's plenty of different topics on Teachers Talk Radio, and they are live all week, and they are on the podcast on Podbean and wherever you get your podcasts as well. Join me again fortnightly at the same time for more Teachers Talk Radio. Bye for now. I've been Catherine Taylor.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.